Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Way is in Training. This is a podcast exploring how warriors should train and fight, as well as how they should live. We will talk about technique, but we'll also dive deep into fitness, mindset, and strategy. We will explore leadership and philosophy as well. So whether you are a young soldier, a veteran police officer, a responsible armed citizen, or simply someone looking for an authentic life, let's examine how the lessons of combat and preparation for it can help us fulfill our potential. Let's explore the way together and learn how the discipline of training can show us our true selves amidst the chaos of life.
Hey everybody, in this episode I've got Joel Levan of Radius Factor, somebody that I don't really know personally, but I'm really interested in the stuff he puts out online as far as like combative self-defense, martial arts, personal protection goes. So why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself and your background, Joel, and we'll just take it from there.
Well, let's see. Let's start. I guess start with training first. I started 1991. So it's been a minute. It's been about 34 years, right? Started in Kempo, American Kempo, and got my black belt in around 96 or 97. It's about 5 or 6 years in. Trained that in addition to kickboxing. Our lineage goes back to with Joe Lewis, if you're familiar with the
kickboxing. Definitely. Highly underrated American martial artist.
Yes, he is, right? It's always nice to hear somebody else say that and know who I'm talking about too, as opposed to the boxer. It's like there's two Joe Lewises, but spelled different. So we had that lineage under him with my instructor, Dennis Knackert in Pennsylvania. Let's see. We would train, most everybody there trains both of those at the same time, and it kind of makes Kempo that much more effective and more fluid, and you have more rhythm. You get a different viewpoint of what works and what doesn't, and in what context. So I trained that for up until 2011 when I got my 4th degree, and I had a lot of overlap in different things. So when we did Kempo, we did kickboxing, and around 2007 I started Pikiti Tirsia Kali, the Filipino martial arts.
Yep.
And been training that ever since, primarily under Tim Wade, until recent. I had a few different instructors at the same time. When I started out, I actually had 3 in the same room. All 3 of them were in the same room. There's Rob Walker, Tim Wade, and Grand Tuan Leo Gahe. That was my first experience in Pikiti, which was pretty awesome.
I've heard of Leo Gahe. I've seen some stuff of his.
Yeah. He's quite the character. And it's interesting to see the different types of movements and between back when he was here in the 70s through now, and how Tim, my former instructor, would how he trains. So everybody has sort of like a different, I'm gonna say a style of it, but they have a different take on the system, and what they taught him or taught them. So things kind of change in terms of how they presented it over the last, what are we talking, 60 years, since the 70s when he came in here in the States. So with Pikiti being, that's a pretty constant. Everything's pretty constant right now with me, with Kempo, kickboxing, and Pikiti, then including jiu-jitsu, and then that's probably the smaller chunk that I have, Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I try to integrate that as much as I can for all the bad situations you're going to be in. Any kind of grappling, obviously. You're on your back. Obviously, it has its strengths, and so I'm still, working my way through that. Kind of partnered up with a couple guys that I teach Pikiti Tirsia with, in kickboxing as well, and we all kind of go back and forth and teaching each other things that we want in our programs. So, and let's see, talking about firearms. I've been shooting since I was a kid. Grew up on a farm out in middle Pennsylvania, and or southeastern part of the state, and hunting the regular shooting around the farm, that kind of thing, and then got some formal training, but and still integrating that. So I wouldn't call myself an instructor, but I integrate as much as I can into any of the tactics or the personal protection that I use or that I offer. So, and then outside of that, just a good physical strength program as much as I can, 3-4 times a week, and then, as far as training, that kind of encapsulates everything in a nutshell, so to speak.
And what about radius factor? Tell us about that.
So that originally was, how do I start? I started under a different name. It's called Sente Marshall Systems. And I wanted something to, at first, how to teach Kempo faster. But you could go years, and in a certain, anybody's familiar with American Kempo, there's a lot of techniques. I think at the end of the day, there's around 200 different techniques. And you're training to learn motion, but do you really need that many? And the more advanced you get, the more you start to cut out. And that's with everything, right? I mean, anything you guys do, I'm sure you've seen it too. The more experience you get, the smaller your skill set gets, more refined. So, but you still kind of understand what all the different timings and all the different ranges and how to use that in different contexts. Yeah, so I started out just to be able to teach that faster. What were the most practical uses, and my instructor would do kind of the same thing. And I would kind of whittle that down for people who were training Kempo. So I wanted to take my experience at how fast I came through the system, and how do you shorten that line, but still gain that skill set. And that's kind of been the premise with Radius Factor when I changed the name in, I think, 2012, somewhere around 2012-ish, with the addition of firearms and different tactics. So when I started training Pikiti, I saw an obvious advantage to training weapons and their perspective of weapons versus what Kempo was. So there's so much that I took out of Kempo as far as what I was teaching to Pikiti, and a lot of it right now, what I teach is Pikiti Tirsia centric. So I try to use as much logic as I can in any kind of programs. I don't really I don't change the fundamental structure of the system per se, but how we communicate it and in what context, how do you get skilled as fast as you can for the context of most people are. Talk about the regular Joes, how they would need it or what they would need and how they would train. How you train is just as important as what you train. Yeah, right. And can't be slow all the time, right? It's got to be fast and it's got to be dynamic. And that as soon as you make things dynamic, it changes what's relevant in certain ranges in a certain context, and what you can pull off. And then I sort of add some design thinking, systems thinking behind all that, like how to present it to general public. Anytime I'm teaching anything that's related to like law enforcement officers or maybe in a military context, even that's all going to change, obviously, for department policies or rules of engagement, that kind of thing, or just what's practical. The funny thing is, there's a common line between all of it, right? It doesn't matter what you do, fighting is going to be fighting. And it's just a matter of is it excessive force in certain contexts, or is it what you need for a military operation or things like that. So
yeah, you said some stuff there I really like. I'm a big believer that the principles of sound technique and tactics don't change.
Yeah.
But technique and tactics change for so many reasons.
Yeah.
Everything from physiology, the way my body is compared to somebody else's, to rules of engagement, like for military or law enforcement, to operational environment, to so many different things impact how you apply those principles, even though they're universal, I think.
Yeah, no, it's not. I mean, it's human movement, right? We all move this, we all have the same, say, biomechanics we might have a different capacity to use them, but whether it's inherent or we learn it. But we don't have a third arm. Things don't change in that regard. That would be helpful.
I was going to make a "that's what she said" joke, but I'm going to leave that alone.
That's a leg. That's a leg. But yeah, I mean, it's when you're talking about range and timing. You talk about range and timing being a fundamental formula for fighting, and obviously the things in between, like angle, pattern recognition, broken rhythm, all that stuff. But range and timing being the kind of default answer to a lot of questions that people would ask, like, would this work here, or would this work there? Are you in the right range for the right thing, and are you using it at the right time? And one really good way to learn that is through knife training. At least through the lineage that I have, I would really focus on. That's why you see any of the videos you see with me moving around with a weapon, edge or impact. We look a little bit different than the other side of Pikiti Tirsia. So when you look at different lineages, they all kind of have a different take on it. And my instructor Tim had basically simplified it in a way that, one, that's what he believes, that's what he was taught, how to make it work, what makes Pikiti Tirsia work. So it's very dynamic. But the process of going from being able to close the gap at a long range and then back out into close quarter and then back out the long range again. There's no real middle ground. A lot of the flow drills you might see that are just kind of complacent. That's kind of in that middle range, but each of us can be hit. But when we're talking about how can I bridge and hit you while you can't hit me at the same time. So that's when you think about it, that fundamentally, it's like, well, every system is kind of like that, right? I mean, that's the object. Me to hit you without you hitting me, and then getting back out of range and changing angle, that kind of thing. It could be flanking, envelopments, whether you got a firearm or any of that. How do I not get shot?
Yeah, no, it's all the same. I mean, if you think about it, like, so much of it's just fixing and flanking. Like so much of it boils down to just that.
Yeah.
When you really get down to it across all different kinds of conflict, how can I keep him from moving to get an advantageous position while I get in an advantageous position myself? Right.
Yeah. And that sums up how Tim Wade would teach a lot of his Pikiti Tirsia. To me, it's like, I take it for granted now, I guess, but a lot of people don't have that understanding of it, even in Pikiti Tirsia when they're doing a lot of these drills, and it becomes real complex, and you're in real close and you're countering with somebody right on top of you. And it's and of course the instructor always wins, right? Because when they're doing a flow drill and they're teaching, it's like, oh, I'm here, I can do this, and I can recounter that. And of course they're leading the class, but for instruction, it kind of gives you an idea of what might work, except that when things start to, when everybody says go, and they're both trying to stab each other, that all kind of goes out the window a lot of times. So the simplification of the system, you're going to strike within a particular range and a particular angle with a particular strike, and be able to land that and then back out at a particular time. So if you don't have the timing, you won't be there, or if the timing changes, the technique changes, but it's got to be in a way that you're protected at the same time. So he would liken it to it's a gunfight, right? So we're not going to stand in front of each other and shoot, stand right in front of each other and take a shot to give one. So it's the same thing with edged or impact weapons, and that validates when you use edged and impact weapons, or say the edge weapon, just because that's where Pikiti is really their strength. That really validates, what your tactic, how I'd say, the execution of your tactic, and the technique that you used. So if you're getting hit while in range, you're obviously not in the right range, right? So I keep all the crossovers and I keep it that simple, and then I can apply it right to firearms training or any kind of everyday carry training that we do. or for that matter, any empty hands training that we use. And whether it's kickboxing or Pikiti Tirsia, which we could talk about some of the differences between those, but just in the general, the general philosophy of going from edge weapons to empty hands shouldn't really change all that much, or any kind of weapon category. When you get more specialized, of course, then things kind of change, especially if it's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and then it's really different. But they still have triangles, they still have flanking. You boil it down to kind of thing. So,
and they've still got capturing the opponent's timing and that kind of sensitivity to what the opponent's doing. And I would argue that's even maybe more prevalent in the grappling stuff. Like, you really learn to be sensitive to what the opponent's intentions are and kind of learn to outflank them, right?
Yeah.
And you said something a minute ago that I really liked, because this is, obviously I've done a lot of traditional arts, right? And I've done some modern stuff too. I've done like some offshoots of JKD that had some FMA stuff in it. I haven't done any formal FMA, although I'm looking at starting up like a Pikiti Tirsia study group. Actually, when we get offline, I'd like to talk to you about that for sure.
Great. Yeah.
Like I had a comp that worked for me that was big in FMA, guy named Aaron Cunningham, really good martial artist. But so I've done informal stuff with Filipino stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I've done a lot of the flow drills, I've done the hubud and the sinawali and all that stuff. And I've done stuff that's got kata in it, right? Both partner kata for the old jujutsu and kimjutsu stuff, and then, karate style solo kata, Iaido style solo kata. And I think what happens too much with traditional arts, and to a lesser degree, I think it happens in like FMA as well, is students start to confuse the medium with the message. Rather than thinking about what is this pattern what training response am I trying to elicit by working Sinawali with a partner? Yeah. Instead, they're like, how can I get better at Sinawali? But that's not really the point, right?
Yes.
Or like, to go back to shooting, like it's like, say, the El Pres drill. Like, almost everybody knows what an El Presidente is, right? You turn and draw 2 rounds each 3 targets, reload 2 rounds each 3 targets. Well, people get hung up in getting better at the El Presidente instead of thinking about what training effect am I trying to elicit by doing this drill? Yes. The drill's only there to make me better at certain things. It's not there to make me better at the drill, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's really prevalent in martial arts, like big time.
Yes. Yeah, and it really comes out in FMA. It's like you get really good at the drill. How do you make it a tactic, right? How do you execute the tactic? And that might change a little bit when you dissolve what that drill is. I mean, the drill is kind of there for. And again, you see my eyes I'm thinking about this, but I hear my instructor in the back of my head that the drill, the tactics are within the drill, and it depends how you teach the drill, because when you look at Pikiti Tirsia, it's almost like there's 2 systems, and you'll see one side teach it one way, and then another side teach it completely different. Like, I think PTK SMF is my lineage, the majority of my lineage. Our first 3 years were with another organization, affiliated with anyway, and with Tim, PTK SMF. That's kind of their premise, where it's, are you executing the drill in a way that you get really good at the drill, and you're refining all the different, maybe the sidestep or where the mechanics should be, but then when you actually go to fight, some of it will change a little bit. And it's going to expand a little bit also. So I think the video I just posted yesterday about Sagang Labo, which is that close quarter tapping of the basically trying to stop this guy from stabbing you in the head with a knife.
Right.
You could use that when at contact distance or extreme close quarter, right? Pikiti would be the range, so it's close. So extreme close quarter is when somebody would draw that knife. But you could also range that out a little bit. Do it at close range, and then maybe you're like, say you're 6 feet away, but somebody comes running at you with a knife, and you don't have time to get out. Being on the inside of that strike is going to be not only it's like the scariest part to be, or place to be, right? It's somebody's going to stab you, and you have no choice but to go either left reverse out and away from that strike, or you got to go all the way in. There's no middle ground. So in one sense, the guy closes the gap so fast that you have to be on the inside because you can't but just because if you try to go out, you end up getting hit. So the drill doesn't necessarily show that per se, but that's how they all sort of overlap. And if you train it in the right way, those things should integrate and work all together depending on range and timing. So it's a pretty effective system. The downside is that there's two systems. Like literally, there is two systems: the Tri-V system, what they call them Pikiti, and then the Dose Methodos. And some people train both. My lineage mostly trained the Dose Methodos. That's a general term for like basically 12 methods of how to manipulate a weapon and move in conjunction with your opponent, but in an organized manner. If you were teaching the military, you wouldn't teach all 12 methods plus the advanced system like Contradas, which is when you don't want it engage with the weapon head on. So if you have all these different ways to manipulate a weapon, but you're trying to teach that to a military or law enforcement context, they're not going to wait years to get all that content. So they shrink it all down. And what Tim did is with Grand Tuan, I think it was in '98, presented it to the Armed Forces of the Philippines. So '98, they introduced it. I think it was like a 15 or 20-minute presentation they were sold on the curriculum that they had basically whittled down. They gave them the core of what Pikiti is, how to fight with a bolo, because that's what they would carry, or they would carry a Gununting. And then in 2000, it became the official system of armed forces of the Philippines, like everything. So the scout, the Rangers, the what was it? Scout Rangers, and the AFP, the police. So I mean, pretty much every law enforcement and every military organization they had in there were learning at least the core methodology. It looks a little bit different now, just because it's kind of other instructors have sort of changed I'm gonna say the integrity of it, but I think some of it was that the core message was lost a little bit. But you'll still see some of the core methods still there. And now he called it the military system, Pikiti Tirsia. So very, very simplified. I still use that for even when I train. Anybody I train for 6 months, it's going to be out of that. And believe it or not, I have a guy I've trained for 12 years, and we still go over that material, because it's, once you learn in day one, it's going to be different than year 12, right? It might be the same thing, but you can perform it 10 times better, or 1,000 times better, would it be? But
you understand so much more about it too. It's like there's that famous Bruce Lee quote, right? When I started, a punch was just a punch and a kick was just a kick. And then as I got better, a punch became so much more than a punch, and a kick became so much more than a kick. But now a punch is just a punch and a kick is just a kick. Like you go through these levels of nuance and complexity only to come back to being simple with the new knowledge.
Right. Right. I think I posted something last night about that. I had overlaid the universal pattern in Kempo, and then there's something in the center that you see a diagonal line, a horizontal, and a vertical. Right. So in Pikiti, it's like you can narrow everything down to 3 angles. Right. So it's either a diagonal, horizontal, or a vertical, and everything else is a variation. And you can see it in the universal pattern. Anything we used, especially in geometry: diagonal, horizontal, vertical. And everything else is just a slight variation. You might have circles, obviously, but a fluid strike or a circular strike can still happen on a diagonal.
Right.
So since I kind of geek out on that kind of stuff, or the simpler you can make it, the better. And it's simpler. And I tell that to everybody. I go, one, teach me like I'm an idiot if I don't know anything. And if I'm going in a jiu-jitsu class, I'm like, simplify it to the point where I can learn it as fast as possible, but and it's okay if the depth or if it's a narrow focus for me, right? I'm going to pick a lane, or I'm going to pick a sort of context that I want to be in, and then teach that. Let me get good at it, and then we'll move on to something else. But when you get stuff thrown at you all the time, from some instructors, how they teach, like, it's not good. What's the phrase? It's like drink from a fire hose.
Yeah.
Right.
No, and I learned, and it's different. Like if you're doing a 2-day class, because the concept for me for a 2-day class is to give people a whole bunch of things they can hopefully take back and train on. I'm not expecting them to get good at any of them in a 2-day class, right? I'm just trying to get them some awareness and knowledge of it. But like ongoing training, I started teaching martial arts as a teenager. And I figured out really quick that if I gave anybody more than one thing to work on at a time, it totally messed them up. Like it just jacked them up big time, because they've got to fix that one thing first, right?
Right.
Work on that thing and then move on to the next thing, the next low hanging fruit,
And what are those things? Because you can go, is it more techniques, is it more tactics, or is it the independent biomechanics of how something works and make it more effective? Right.
The attributes.
All the attributes, right? So if you've got if you're just working a jab and an elbow, right? There's a whole lot going on there other than just the jab and the elbow. So it's like, anytime I teach, we're talking about newer students or newer classes, it's always going to be on a progression of what can you do right now with the inherent capability that you have, and what's the most probable attack, let's say, but what's the most practical way to approach that, and then do that every class, every month, every 3 months, every 6 months, and then start to build that way, as opposed to just dumping a bunch of stuff to people and have them try to figure it out. So the way I teach is pretty methodical, and I can really care about what I'm teaching to someone and how fast they actually gain the skill, and that may mean that I stick around a little bit longer and make sure that they get it, but not confuse them so much that they go away. I'm like, I don't know what I just learned. I mean, I've been in that context too, where I'm went to another country to learn something, the Philippines, for instance, and come back in your head just like I don't even know if I can articulate what I learned. But obviously there's a core there. Like it takes a little while for it to kind of digest, but there could be different ways to simplify that, so you can take in that progression, let's say, to encode it a little bit better. But it just, things can get messy if you don't have that methodology of like simplification and validation and getting things to work today, and what it might be like in a few weeks. So I mean, what kind of, like when you teach your stuff, do you have that sort of same process? Like if you're teaching tactics, I think you're just starting to mention it, but I'd like to hear that from what your process is on that too.
So, like, I've got 2 tracks of my classes, right? I've got like skill development classes and I've got tactics classes. And because it's not like a dojo environment where people are coming back, 2-3 times a week, every week for years, it kind of changes the way I approach it. Like if I had, say I had a study group that was going to work on defensive shooting, and we met twice a week, I would teach them more like a traditional martial arts approach, more kind of like what you're talking about, like building on things over the long term, giving you something that works right now, but then slowly adding nuance and level of complexity to it as time goes by. But because of the compressed time frame, and I think a lot of people get this wrong, and I'm going to talk about this in a second too. I'm going to circle back around to that. But like I try to give them a framework they can use to inform their training moving forward. So things they can bring into the way they train moving forward, especially in the skill development class. So it's very heavily based on like the principles of training, different kinds of drills, how to choose a drill, how to design a drill, like how to do that to elicit the training effect you're trying to get. rather than just going on YouTube and picking a bunch of things that look cool and going out there and making gun smoke and spent brass and loud noise, right? The tactics classes are a little bit different in the sense that everything, like you said, is very simple, right? They're broader than they would be if I was doing an ongoing, like regular class, like we talked about. I would focus more on one skill at a time, you know, and work on things over multiple lessons, so people had stuff in the longer run, right? Because that's how you train things. You don't train everything at once. You know, it's not, you've got to focus on something and make that better.
Right.
But because it's a 2-day class, I try to expose them to what I consider kind of like the core basic foundational fundamentals for fighting with a handgun as a civilian, right?
Yep.
And so it's kind of similar to what you're saying. It's stuff that it'll work for them right now if they have a basic level of shooting ability, shooting skill.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I like that. And you know, it's interesting. Even in the gun industry, you don't seem to hear that articulated enough. You get a lot of flat range training, and they're talking. You know, a lot of the maybe it's just Instagram and YouTube. But even some of the courses I've been in, they're not teaching in that way per se. And I don't know if that's partly the commercialization part of it, like want to keep people's interest, or but they want to. And I'm fine with like taking less business if I just to get somebody to get it right.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Okay.
I got to say this because I was going to circle back around to this.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people get it wrong, and they get it wrong in personal protection across the board, whether you're talking not martial artists per se, but people that want to be able to defend themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're talking shooting, combatives, people conflate the training class with the active training. And because like a training class in the shooting world, or like the ECQC class, which is a phenomenal class, I'm not knocking the training at all. That's not my point. I'm talking about the perception on a lot of part of the students, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's more like a seminar in the martial arts world.
Yes.
Which is like a special thing you do every so often to kind of add a little bit to your training and take new lessons away from, and kind of go through a little rite of passage with your dojo buddies and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
That's not training. Training is what you do every day.
Yeah.
Training is what you do when you wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and you do your dry fire and you hit the heavy bag and you do your workout. Like that's training. Training is what you do every day, not the 6 classes you went to this year.
Right. Which would be kind of funny. How long have you been training? I don't know, 6 classes, right? That's a good articulation and distinction of that. And I guess every sort of system or I don't want to say system, but instructor, I should say instructor, may present this in a different way. Like when I was training with Tim, he lives in Dallas, I live in Pennsylvania, so he would come up, and this gives some credit to the methodology that he has teaching. I would see him probably every quarter for 3 days, so we'd probably get maybe 20 hours of training. Like in Pikiti, we train. When we get together, we would train a lot. So it's like all day. So between 3 days and then some private training to kind of get it sort of honed in and try to get an understanding of it. So long distance, and then any kind of like calls and a little bit of video at the same time, you actually get pretty skilled just with that, which is really interesting. On that core level, things that really matter. And I think that's basically how I still teach. So even if it's going to be at a seminar, I won't dump a bunch of stuff in it just so they get to see it, unless they ask on the outside of class. But it's always that core levels. Because if I want someone to come, if someone's going to be in my class during a seminar, whether it's a 1 day, 2 day, or 3 day, or I'm hired to do that for law enforcement, they got to have those skills that they're going to be able to use. But then they have to have a methodology to take back. Like I think you just mentioned it. They got to have something to take back that they can see it and go, all right, there's a method here. I'm going to take that and start to train that while in between the next session. And then there's different ways of, not every system I think can do this, but because some of it's like gives you the certain methodologies give you the ability to self-correct, or the instruction that you've gotten, you can self-correct certain things. And obviously it's not going to be as good if you were with him, privately every day for 5 years, like he was with Grant Tuan. At one point Tim had moved to the Philippines and was living with Grant Tuan and literally they were training every day, which was probably pretty amazing. So there's got to be some give and take, obviously, with certain seminars and what you learn. And so I think people can take that out of context about like how long they've been training and how many hours they put in.
And I think that if you do the work, like I had he unfortunately passed away last year, but Kuroda Sensei was like one of the last like heads of a family ryu of like old school kinjutsu and jujutsu and iaijutsu from Japan. And we had a study group when I was in Chicago at my dojo, and we would see him 4 times a year, just like you were saying, right? And then in between, it would be us trying to figure things out and work on it with each other. But it only worked seeing him 4 times a year because we did that, because we did the work in between.
Right.
And that's kind of a little bit different than like the criticism I had a minute ago. And I think these people are well-meaning, they just don't understand the training paradigm, right? Like you wouldn't expect to become a high-level athlete at a sport only going to 6 seminars a year, right? That's
exactly.
It's just not going to happen. You've got to put in the work. You've got to put in the hours in the gym, and you're not going to fight in the octagon if you only go to 6 martial arts seminars a year. Well, you could fight in it, but your chances of winning, your chances of winning probably aren't that great, right? You got to put in the work. And I think people, and once again, I don't want to be too harsh because a lot of this depends on people's personal goals. Like what is their desired end state, right? And if they're just people that are just looking for basic knowledge and self-protection with a firearm, that may be enough for them, And I'm not saying that's not okay, as long as they're realistic about how good they're going to get and what they're trying to accomplish.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So, basically the conditions for expectations, right? So if they're
right,
and for some people, I teach. Some of them they want to go deeper into Pikiti Tirsia, into the different methods, and I'm going to get more like the cultural aspect of it. And I'm like, here are the things that really, really work, especially in personal protection. Because I'm always going from that, like a modern day. I'll get criticized for this, but if you using Pikiti now versus 150 years ago, we're not cutting people's hands off. We're not taking their heads, that kind of thing. But what are the things that you can actually learn that it enhances your ability to protect yourself right in 2025? And some of that is the same, some of it exactly the same. Other things like, well, you kind of dial this back or whatever, or the amount of force you would use, or the type of weapon you would use, or no weapons. But there's the aspect of enjoyment, of just loving to do the system, loving to train the system. And then, some people like to do the practical part of it, and then others just like to do it because they like to do it. And to me, there's nothing wrong with that with anything. Like if you only do it for the enjoyment of something, then, as long as that's what that is. Right.
And that's kind of funny too. Like I used to be really critical of people that put on plate carriers and helmets that have never been in the military and go out and shoot on the range in full kit. Like I used to have the attitude a lot of veterans have, which is like, we had 20 years. Like if you really wanted to do it, you could have done it with us for real,
Oh, right.
And that was always the attitude I had. But looking back on that, I think I was too hard on them. And depending on what they're doing it for, right?
Yeah.
If they're doing it because they think it's the way they're going to defend themselves as a civilian in 2025, they're probably not looking at it the right way.
Yeah.
But like, I've got a Japanese sword and a European sword on the wall back here that I've trained with, right? Like I like training in those things. Am I going to walk around with a katana or a longsword on my hip in 2025? No. Did I do that thinking that was going to carry over? Like the principles, I've learned a lot about the principles of combat from doing that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
But that's the principles. If I did that thinking that that was going to carry over 1-to-1 to what I'm doing today, that would be foolish. But I
Right.
did it because I enjoyed the movement and what I learned about kind of the universal field theory of human conflict from doing stuff like that, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's okay. So if somebody's putting on a kit and a plate carrier because they're looking at it as like a martial art and their way to kind of work on mastery of something and polish themselves, I'm a lot kinder to them than I used to be. I'm less arrogant in my old age about it.
That's it. So LARPing, right? For us civilian. Yeah, I would say I know some guys that show up and they're like, they're it's funny in Pikiti Tirsia we'd all be decked out in camo because that's what the their military would use, or how in the Philippines that's what they would use because it's kind of like their claim to fame is that being a military system over there. So everybody, the uniform would be like a
Like BDUs, yeah.
BDUs, yeah. Either the woodland camo was
Cries,
big.
yeah.
Right. And if you had the tiger stripes, you're really cool.
Oh, but black tiger stripe is the heat. That's the hotness.
Oh, that's hot right now. That's true. I like that. I might have a T-shirt with that, but so even I did a little bit of that, just being real excited to be in the system, and that's what they promoted to wear, and I'm like, well, okay, you get a little bit of weird looks from the people outside of the class when they're like, these guys are all dressed up in BDUs and like, what are they doing with swords? And it's you sort of get a sort of a stereotype at some point. Is it a cult? Or what is it? They called it some other things too, but right now it's just like more like gray men, or just just show up in your jeans and T-shirt. I don't care, or just whatever you're going to wear on a daily basis. Typically is what we're going to be training with. Obviously not a nice suit, but you have to account for apparel, obviously. But when we train, it's going to be with people who love to train, love to protect themselves, their family, people around them. If they're all normal people, when you bring out the blade, start training, that changes people's perception of what you're actually training and why you're training it, that's a whole. You can go down that rabbit hole, or you can we can go into that conversation about what people think of Filipino martial artists, and what they do and how much relevance there is. You started talking about that with the sword, and like for us, it's if you're training the long weapon, it's basically you're covering all the categories of weapons. So you're learning long weapon, the short knife, or anything you put in your hand, and then empty hands, and in that progression. And how fast you get to that progression just depends on the instructor, or what context you're training in. If it's personal protection, obviously you can start to dissolve that a little bit and kind of shrink it. But if you're really learning in depth principles of Pikiti Tirsia and going through all the methodologies, then you train the weapons of that method. I don't necessarily train everybody that way. I try to keep the core aspect of the system. I don't change that, but I put it in the context of how we were able to use it on an everyday level.
And I think that's important too. And I don't think enough martial arts instructors do much more than lip service to that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, even like, so I'm a big fan of like engaging in some sort of combat sport at some point in your training journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it allows you to have an opponent that is totally resisting everything you're doing.
Yep.
Relatively safely. I won't say it's totally safe, because it is a combat sport, right? You might get your bell rung, you might get something broken, but it's a lot safer than a street fight, right?
Yeah.
And having that opponent that is being completely resistant to you is an invaluable experience, and it changes the way you look at martial arts forever. Like if all you've done is train in like some strip mall McDojo where everybody's very cooperative.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying there's not a time and a place for that as part of your training, because there is when you're learning things and you're trying to work through stuff, absolutely. You can't just beat each other up all the time.
Yeah.
But like you were saying a minute ago about the flow drills, right? It's very different when somebody's not doing their part of the drill.
Yeah, right. You're doing the drill wrong. Wait a minute.
Yeah. No, don't grab me that way. Grab me this way.
Right. It's like a lot of beginners, you attack me wrong.
You get what I'm saying, though. And I think
Right.
that I think is one of the real strengths of like judo and BJJ, because I've done a lot of like classical jiu-jitsu stuff, and I love the techniques in it, right? And the training methodologies do have value, but I think you also need to do randori, right? You need to roll. You need to do all that stuff because you've got to figure out how to make somebody else do what you want, because that's ultimately what conflict is. It's imposing your will on somebody else through the use of force.
Right.
And if you don't figure that out, all the fancy lethal techniques in the world aren't going to do you a single bit of good, because you can't make them work.
Yeah.
And so, that goes back to shooting too, right? So this is a conversation I had with my buddy, Les Kismartoni. If you don't follow him, you should. He's Les Pepperoni on IG. He's a national champion shooter. He was my training partner for shooting competitions for a couple of years before he moved.
Oh, you just had her on, right?
In Illinois. Yeah.
Okay.
Really solid guy. He does BJJ, right? He's a purple belt in BJJ. Would be higher, but he became a cop late in life. So the police work started getting in the way for a while with the academy and field training and all that. But we were talking about this because we both competed pretty heavily, right? And shooting competition, like, sport shooting, action shooting competition is invaluable for building hard skills. But at the end of the day, it's punching the heavy bag. At the end of the day, you're not fighting an opponent. And like one of the things I always tell people in my my like tactics classes for civilians, my concealed carry class. I don't want to say concealed carry because it's not a permit class. It's not what I mean. Working with a concealed weapon. Is that, they may not have access to force on force like I did. And I had access to a lot of it based on the jobs I had as a cop and as a soldier. But they could go play paintball or airsoft. And are those things realistic? No, they're not.
Right.
But you know what you have in those you don't have in an IDPA or USPSA match? You have an opponent who's not going to do what you want him to do.
Yeah.
That piece is so important. Like that little piece makes everything different.
I love this conversation, this part of the conversation, because it's like you got the drill or you're working techniques and you're working tactics just to learn it against someone in front of you. And then you start to add that component of okay, when I do this, he does that. And that can be compartmentalized or that can be within a flow. But we kind of, let me see if we get your opinion on this. How we train Pikiti Tirsia, especially if we're attacking, you got someone who's on the has the initiative or has the offense, and the other one is on counter offense. So each has a role depending on range and timing, and you're both trying to hit each other either in the offensive aspect or the counter offensive aspect, and it might be like a zigzag, or flanking, whether you go from usually on the outside of the weapon hand, right, trying to get to the outside of that. There are times that if you got an environment, you got to go the other way, and with a different weapon to weapon interaction. And we spar the same way. So we have a saying. It's the training method is the combat execution. So if you're doing CQB and you're going through a corner fed room, whether it's whether it's one or you got a team of 5 or 6. How you enter that room, you all have a flow to it, right?
Yeah.
And not much changes unless the timing sort of changes, or you pick up another threat, right, which may disturb the timing, and then you got to readjust. What we do when we fight with weapons, it's especially when we know that the fight's on, it's not much different than that. Unless someone is really trying to basically be a kamikaze and kind of, they go right down the center line, which is dangerous, right? And then you have to get off on the angles, or both angles and depth or height. So a lot of that's, would you say at least with that rushed explanation I just had. Do you see the similarities in those two? Like there's a flow to it, right?
I absolutely, yeah. Oh, I absolutely
Yeah.
do. And I have something I can add to this, right? So
Yeah.
I got to do a lot of entries as part of a team in my dual careers, right? Because I was in 20th Special Forces Group and I was on Chicago SWAT. And people, this is another place where people confuse the medium with the message, right? The Arthur Murray dance steps of CQB, where you put your feet. You and I have gray in our beard, so we understand that reference. People on the podcast who are listening,
right there, who?
It was this dancing school where they had painted footprints on the floor, and that was where you put your feet. Right? That stuff is completely invaluable, right, for learning the framework.
Yeah.
And then eventually you get to be like a jazz musician. You can play off the melody. And that's what free flow CQB becomes.
Yeah.
But here's the thing about it is that once the gunfight starts, you're no longer searching. And those patterns are how you are searching and setting yourself up for the best place to be for the gunfight. So it changes once it's a two-way gunfight. Things start to change, right? And one of the things I used to do with my SWAT kids, and I say kids, but these are like the new guys, the guys coming through our operator course, is I would take two teams, and we usually, depending on the size of the class, we might have 4 teams. We might only have enough, like 2 small teams, 2 4-man teams, depending on how many operators we had coming through. And our simunition shoot house had multiple breach points. So I would take, one squad, one team, and go, okay, this is your breach point. You are doing a hit on a house that has an active terror cell that is well trained from overseas. I go to the other team on the other side of the building and go, okay, this is your breach point. You're doing a hit on a house that has a well-trained terrorist team here from overseas. Both teams thought they were the good guys. There was no script. There was no, you sit here and when they do this, you do that. It was truly like free form. What happens when you're fighting your mirror image? And it was great training. And I don't think enough teams, either military or law enforcement, do that. Because things did change, sometimes drastically. And not because people weren't doing the right thing sometimes. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was because their training fell apart and I had to like kind of school them a little bit. But a lot of the times it was just the reality of adapting to the situation where you're no longer on that melody. You're playing off the melody now.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? So yeah,
Absolutely.
it's like the patterns, the flow drills in FMA, and then what they really look like when you're fighting somebody. You know, or like the Aikido and Jiu-Jitsu that I did. I use those techniques a lot on the street as a cop. Do they look anything like they did in the dojo? No.
Right.
Because it was a resistant opponent. You know what I mean? Like it, maybe once or twice they did because the guy was really horrible and I had a really good day and it just happened to work out that way. And I wish I had those on video, but most of the time it looked like randori from judo, not like some pretty Jiu-Jitsu kata. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing.
Let me ask you this: when both sides thought that they were the good guy, how did that change? How did that change how they approached?
It didn't change anything until the bullets started flying. But what I did was, because normally when you do a scenario, you've got your role players that are the bad guys, and you give them very specific actions to do, right? Because you're trying to reinforce the training. This is like, it's more basic level stuff, right? Yeah. So you're trying to reinforce those patterns, those flow drills, like in FMA, and make them better and more efficient and make sure they're set up right for the gunfight. But those engagements are very brief. Usually that guy gets zipped pretty quick and goes down, And in those circumstances, those scripted training runs, if a good guy gets hit, it's definitely a fail. He did something wrong. Now, when it was both teams working against each other, it became much more like a fight, right? I mean, everything looked the same until they encountered each other, and then it became just a pure-on fight. And I wanted to give them that experience in Sims and Force on Force before if they ever had to do it for real, so they had been there before. Yeah. So when they had to come off their pattern, they would have sports psychologists call it chunking, right? When you have those chunks of
Yes.
information you develop,
Yep.
they would have those chunks developed that they could assemble like Legos and handle the problem, rather than being totally improvising without any experience of. And that was kind of the idea behind it.
Love that. That's my other background's in design, so chunking is one of the principles for learning things faster, and so I geek out on. I like to geek out on that kind of stuff too. But it's interesting when you talk about force on force and how you have what the prescribed method or tactic is, and then the other guy responds in a certain way, so you can actually learn it based on range of timing. And then when they don't do what they're supposed to do, how it changes. And you should have and that's part of your training too, right? So at some point though, when that happens, you have to have a skill set to be able to adapt to that while still being protected. So if I'm doing a forehand strike and a backhand strike while I'm closing on the angle, and they're countering each one of those, and he maintains that distance or matches that distance. What if he doesn't? Right. So there's another methodology. What if he doesn't do anything that's like, I'm gonna say it's all defined in Pikiti Tirsia, but if he goes a different angle that you didn't expect, so you kind of have to use that principle of no mind, of you're gonna attack the way you need to be able to do and keep yourself protected, and neutralize their weapon. But at the same time, you have to just respond to whatever thing that they just did that took you off of timing. So you have to be able to, just in that quarter of a second, be able to adapt in a certain way that it's in the system, but it should be part of your practice. And then you have to actually be able to do it for real, whether you're hit it up or whatever. And
regaining initiative, right? Regaining initiative. And that's something that, that's always something that we talked about in my LE and military tactical backgrounds. And usually that was like if you're bogged down and you use a flashbang or something to regain the initiative and keep pressing forward. But that happens in one-on-one conflict as well, right?
Absolutely.
When your opponent gains the initiative, you have to regain it, or you're just going to be defending yourself against him. And you might get a good counter in him and win the fight that way, but you're much less likely to win if you're on his initiative.
Yes.
Like I hate the buzzwords, like OODA loop became a real big buzzword in the tactical community.
Yeah.
And I love the writings of Colonel John Boyd. I really do. The guy was a genius, right?
Yeah.
And very much in line with what we're talking about, just in the context of air combat, dogfights. But because it became a buzzword, it degraded into Beetlejuice. You say OODA loop 3 times fast, and now you know what you're talking about. And you got to understand what it actually means. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's a lot to it. It's not just, I'm going to do something and surprise this guy. There's a lot more to it than that. There's a lot of levels of initiative and how to regain the initiative, how to set the other person up so they think they have the initiative, but they don't. And none of that stuff can be learned without an opponent. And that I think is where a lot of that's why I think a lot of civilians who into defending themselves should do some sort of sport that involves projectiles, airsoft or paintball, not because they're realistic. That's not my point, but because you're learning that initiative and that timing and that broken rhythm. And you're learning to see the opponent's timing. And you'll never learn that without an opponent.
Right. That's your incentive. You don't want to be on the center line. You don't want to be in the same spot, right? That's a huge one, and not to disparage any kind of other instructors or other systems, FMA or anything, and especially in FMA, that it's not so prevalent. That training methodology and that mindset is not real prevalent in Filipino martial arts. It might be, but there's what we call mutual destructions. So or you take one to give one. There's a whole lot of that. And usually people they got the face masks on, they're all kitted up, and they're just whacking each other. And it's that would never happen if you had an impact, especially if you had a blade. But even if you had a good stick, good solid stick, most people won't stand and bang right there. And there's no use, there's no practical use for that, because you're going to both be either really injured or dead. So there's got to be a training methodology that would ensure that didn't happen. Now, obviously, it's the first one to make a mistake, and then if you make a mistake, that happens. but there should be a training methodology and defined in a way to be able to so you can do self-correction so that doesn't actually happen.
So one of the examples I use in my tactics class for civilians is that so the Japanese are meticulous record keepers, right? Some would say that they're an ADD culture when it comes to record keeping, and they actually, in the Middle Ages, if you got in a duel as a samurai, as long as you reported it to the local magistrate or the local lord right away, it was assumed that you were justified in your duel. But if you didn't report it right away, you would be assumed to be guilty.
Interesting.
Right? So, I mean, I'm probably oversimplifying this, but it makes a point, right? So they have all these records of these duels, these one-on-one fights between samurai not wearing armor, but armed with a meter-long razor blade, right? For hundreds of years. Something like 60 to 70% ended with both parties either dead or permanently maimed. Wow. They called it Ayuchi. And it means the same thing you just said, mutual destruction, right? Mm-hmm. And people don't understand the relevance of that today. Like if you get in a gunfight today, the average gunfight, I mean, the statistic really is true. This really is the average. 3 to 5 yards, 3 to 5 seconds, 3 to 5 shots, right? Now, that's not all of them. And that's not all you should train for, because I know my luck and I'm going to get the outlier. I'm going to get the scene from Heat when everybody else gets to 3 to 5 yards, right? It's just the way my luck goes. But if you think about it, that Ayuchi concept still applies today, because unless you get that instant incapacitation from a headshot, someone, if they have the will to fight and the will to live, can literally be functionally, they're going to be dead for 2 minutes before they actually finally stop fighting. From a heart shot, right? Mm-hmm. So it is entirely possible that you might be the guy that gets off that blazing sub-second draw from concealment and puts 6 rounds in his high center chest, and he's just stubborn enough to get one shot off that hits you in the face. Unless you take into account that possibility and use, like you said, angles, getting off the line of attack, all of these other things that factor into it, right?
Yeah.
It's, there's dead right now, and there's dead and don't know it yet. And yep. They're far more likely to be dead and don't know it yet than they are to be dead right now.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing as with the samurai, or like in the Philippines, is that, I mean, defanging the snake, right? They could cut my artery and I could be functionally dead if I don't get to a hospital, and still be fighting long enough to get a lethal blow in, right? It's
right.
It's not, people don't just fall down like in the movies.
Not point fighting, right? It's not point fighting, right?
No. Yame! Yame! Ippon! No, that's not how it works.
Right. Yeah. Man, we could talk about this for a good while. That's another overlapping sort of conversation we have in Pikiti when we're training and when we're sparring. There's training for pattern recognition, being able to be in the right time, the right place, with the right countering the right weapon interaction.
Chunking.
I don't know, chunking, yeah. But being able to see, that moving weapon really dynamically. Where do you place yourself? How do you strike? And at what time? And a lot of it has to do with when it crosses the center line, like who has better timing. So if you cross the center line first, you generally have better timing. That's a broad assumption. But just because you nicked the elbow a little bit doesn't mean you got him, right? It could be, maybe you nicked him a little bit, but then he came back with and you were like, oh, I got you. And then he got hit with a horizontal right across the head. And that's generally where the mutual destructions happen too, where you either don't have the right weapon interaction happening, which is a thing, and it's trainable, or you're at the wrong range at the wrong time. And both of those, you can't really separate range and timing in those angles. But there's going to be times where you think you got them, and the follow, just because of the follow-up shot. Because if you're training with somebody, especially without equipment, we do a lot of stuff without protective gear. for specific reasons. One, you got to realize the threat that's in front of you. And then we have different levels of force, of course. But when someone really doesn't realize what just happened, and you stay in place and then you get hit. So there shouldn't really ever be that, unless you just flat out made a mistake, like you misjudged something, or the other guy was just faster, more superior than where you were. But it's a constant conversation when we're sparring and fighting, and the way we spar. And sometimes we get criticized for not having the headgear on and the gloves and everything, and which isn't a big deal, because you still that's there so you don't get hit. When you make a mistake, you don't get hit in the actual head. It's not to it's not armor where you're both kind of clashing, right? And they go for the takedown, and then looking for the joints to cut. It's just in case somebody makes a mistake. So the training methodology shouldn't necessarily, or the tactics shouldn't really change all that much. The technique might, but it should still look pretty similar. There's a quote by Paul Howe saying a good system will take any kind of methodology when you go from tactic to paintball, or to your force on force, and it shouldn't be much different.
Yeah,
and that kind of
should be the same. You should be acting the same for both.
Yeah.
Why are you drilling basics if it's not how you're gonna apply them? Yeah.
Right.
Unless there's a desired training effect, unless you're intentionally exaggerating something to elicit that training response, which is a different thing.
Yeah.
And that brings me to something else I wanted to ask you about. Because this is something that I've always thought, and I'm going to tie this into shooting competition in a minute and how that affects CQB, right? So one of the things I always thought was really cool about the FMA stuff that I've done, and like I said, I'm not formally trained in it. It was like an adjunct to JKD, and then, informal training with friends that were pretty heavy into it. But the end of that stick moves so much faster than a hand.
Yep.
So you become acclimated to seeing and processing visual input faster.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
And the reason this ties back around to shooting, and this is one of the reasons why I think people should do action shooting sports as part of their training if they want to be defensive shooters, if they're serious about getting to a certain level of skill. If they just want a baseline level of competence, that's a different issue, right? And that's not up to me to decide. But if you want to be really good at it, one of the things that shooting sports does for you, it's not just that your manipulations get faster. It's not just that your shooting gets faster. It's that you learn to see faster.
Yes.
When I got serious into USPSA, CQB all of a sudden became, because I was still at work at the time, I hadn't retired yet, right? CQB became much easier for me, not because a USPSA stage has anything similar in terms of tactics to CQB, because it does not. It's just shooting everything as fast as you can, right? But even dynamic CQB is at a much more sedate pace than a USPSA stage. So it got to where it felt like I was moving in slow motion, moving at the right speed. So I was able to take in more of my environmental information, more of the situation around me, make more decisions, make them better, faster, because I could see faster.
Yeah.
Right. It also kept me more relaxed in the moment because I was more aware of everything going on. And I noticed the same thing years ago, training in FMA in my own little informal way. And then going back to like sparring with empty hands is now somebody's jab that seemed fast before didn't seem fast at all.
Yeah. Yeah. We love this conversation. I mean, even just so detecting threats even faster, right? So whether they're pulling something out of their waistline, because that's a chamber position, that's our number 3, the chamber position, or you see this, like you see somebody, there's the pick up the actual knife, got the knife, right? As soon as you can recognize that, because that's in our flow and how we fight, that's a chamber position. You see that much faster. Go across the body, that kind of thing. Even just
well,
that
I
part.
actually kind of worry about that sometimes too. I actually kind of worry about that because I've got so much experience at reading pre-attack cues from being a cop in Chicago that now that I'm a civilian, sometimes I'm afraid that I may make an action that is perfectly justifiable, but a jury may not realize it is, because I saw the pre-attack cue and acted on it knowing what was coming.
Yeah.
So that's a thought. I mean, it's kind of a digression. Sorry, I kind of interrupted you.
No, that's a good one. That's a good crossover, because you still have to articulate it, right? And you have to have that special skill. Like, someone on the jury is not going to be able to understand that per se, because they don't train.
You've got to explain it to them. You've got to be able to articulate why you felt in danger.
Yeah. It's like, if you played baseball and you're up against somebody's throwing 100 miles an hour, which is not all that rare now, and that ball's traveling toward your head, right? But you can see that coming halfway down between the mound and home plate. To get out of the way. That's going to be a threat if you don't move. And it's kind of the same thing with weapons, right? Or an impact weapon or an edge weapon, or just pulling anything. That's going to be a threat, because the halfway down that to contact is that thing already there, and it's happening so fast because your purpose of training is to be better and outmaneuver your opponent, right? So if you can detect any of that faster, like, what are you going to do? Like, wait until you get hit first and then shoot them, and then or didn't hit them? Told you. It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, but I mean, it's the reality of it, right? And like we said a minute ago, it's so much of being good at conflict is about seizing and maintaining the initiative.
Yeah.
And that's just, I mean, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how fast my draw is if the guy starts his half a second before mine.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my videos I posted, we're talking the whole thing, the whole sub-second draw was really big on YouTube and on the socials. And talking about, you see a lot of guys who get up on the target and they're shooting really fast, but they're not really moving anywhere.
Yeah.
At what point does that not work? It's like you can be shot and still, like we were talking about a little while ago, if somebody had a knife and they're running toward you, you might get shot off, but you still might get hit with that blade. So if you're not moving in a particular way, and at a particular range and off the arc of that weapon, you might get hit. So going back to the training methodology, if you're using the sub-second draw to get better, just to get faster at drawing, but that wouldn't necessarily be the winning tactic, or even the counter tactic. So that's we kind of overlay a lot of that stuff when we're talking about range and timing and the follow through of the strike. So whether it's the bullet or it's the actual tip of the weapon coming through, because it's so fast, and you have to be able to learn to, you train fast, or you train with the C speed, and just internalize it in a way that you can counter that much more intuitively than consciously. Some of it is obviously, but because you're looking at patterns and the type of methodology that they're striking with. But on a core level, again, diagonal, horizontal, vertical, and then some sort of maybe jabbing type of energy on those lines too. But I love hearing all the crossovers between what you go through and what we do, and it kind of makes me feel better. Number one, especially with your background. But I find it so much interesting that we can both different backgrounds, we can agree to a lot of the same things of like how combat happens.
I think the principles are universal, and if you read into it, you read the same stuff from Musashi or Machiavelli or Sun Tzu or Clausewitz. Like it's all there.
Yeah.
Or like lately I've been geeking out on historical European martial arts. And like I said, not because there's any real, I mean, some of the knife stuff, some of the grappling stuff is practical, but most of it, I mean, like I said, I'm not going to be walking around the streets of Austin with a long sword. Although it is legal in Texas. God bless Texas.
Right? I know, that's pretty awesome. You can walk around with a sword.
But I'm still not going to do it, right?
Yeah, right.
But what I've really been enjoying about it is, like, I've been reading these German and Italian treatises on the longsword from, like, the 14th and 15th centuries and 16th century. And I'm probably getting the dates wrong. So any HEMA purists out there, don't hit me up in the comments and crucify me. I'm very much an amateur when it comes to that, okay?
I know there's going to be at least one guy who's watching.
Oh yeah, there's going to be at least one. But like, if I know it's not the 14th century. Longswords weren't that early. I get that. Okay, it just rolled off my tongue. Forgive me. Okay, but what I love about reading these treatises and practicing these techniques is I'm getting a new way of looking at the same things. So it's still the same stuff. It's still the same core principles, right?
Yeah.
But it's a different way of approaching it and looking at it. And I think that one of the things I love about all this stuff is that the more ways you find to approach the same principles, the more you understand them. And the more, going back to chunking, the more chunks you get that you can now apply in the real world.
Yeah.
And, you know, the sword stuff at a fundamental principle level is not that much different than the gunfighting stuff, especially when you're talking about, you know, one-on-one civilian conflict, right?
Yeah.
With both weapon systems, right?
Yep.
You know, it's all still about initiative and angles and timing, and it's all the same stuff.
Yeah. It's funny. My instructor, Tim, he was a former Marine, so all the stuff we're saying is like all the things he's, you know, how he communicates us, you know, about initiative and especially this is the gunfight. It's basically when you fight with a knife, it should be principles should carry over to the gun, or right. Not going to take a shot to give one. And then you go, okay, what about boxing? Boxing, technically, I mean, it's a sport, but you know, you got a resisting opponent. You've got things might change a little bit when you go bare knuckle, or when it's, you know, you can do anything. You can pick up a chair and hit somebody because they're, you know, they're standing ready, and you hit them with a chair, and then it's something off the context. But still, the point of not
striking. I always like the phrase environmental striking.
Striking, you're right. Yeah, whether you throw something at them or you shove them into a corner of a table or something, right? That's all that good stuff. I like that. But you know, obviously, anytime you fight, you want to be able to hit without being hit. So if someone doesn't have a training methodology to not only the tactic but the training methodology of how to make that work, make that happen, if they're not using that, that's when you're going to see, you know, mutual destructions, and you're all beat up, and you know, you're getting hit, and you're like, why am I getting hit? And that was my first 3 years of Pikiti Tirsia, because I wasn't taught in a way that that accounted for that, because they didn't have the methodology. So it's almost like there was this secret methodology within the system, but I mean, not necessarily a secret. It's just a knowledge that I didn't have at the time, and that's one of the reasons why I switched organization and focused in a certain path, because I was just getting eaten alive the first 3 years of just getting, you know, tagged left and right with a stick, or with a, you know, rattan, which would be a knife or an edge. So I'm like, oh, okay, I got to change something, because this whatever I was doing for the last 3 years isn't working. So thankfully, I'd gotten the right people at the right time, and then so it brings me to now, and I'm trying to impart that same level of skill set or training to people. So
well, on that note, because we're well over an hour, which is kind of what I expected. Yeah. I've been enjoying the conversation too. This has been
me too.
Tell everybody where to find you, you know, what you've got out there, what they can look for from you, and all that good stuff. Go ahead and promote yourself a little bit.
Thanks. Well, you can go to radiusfactor.com. You can learn a little bit more about what I train, and how I kind of present the material. You can also go to radiuscombatives.com, and it's a little bit more specific to the combatives aspect of it, because Radius Factor is kind of a consultancy for personal protection, a little bit of survival training, specialist stuff, and it's kind of merged into some of my consulting aspects of design and whatnot. But radiusfactor.com, radiuscombatives.com. You can hit me up on Instagram. Be Radius Factor there. YouTube, I think, what is it? I think the same thing. It's actually Joel Levan on YouTube. And I just teamed up with a guy who's teaching jiu-jitsu from Alliance in Paoli, Pennsylvania. So we're going to open up a school, or open up a program where we're basically kind of sharing both. So I'm going to have my combatives material there, and he's going to have all of his jiu-jitsu and all that goodness there. It's a 6,000 square foot facility, and then there's also
nice.
a strength. Yeah, it should be pretty fun. That should end up opening at the end of the month. So I'll have seminars and but everyday classes as well. So, and that's, I'll talk to anybody, I'll train anyone, and we'll have a good time.
Well, thanks for coming on. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and if you're up for it, we should do part 2 at some point.
I'd love that. Thanks, Matt, and thank you for
no, for sure. I'm
putting it
glad I
together.
reached out.
Great.
Yeah, no,
Me
this
too.
is good. All right. Well, thanks everybody. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Definitely check Joel out. I'm really impressed with the stuff he puts out, and I like the way the guy thinks. So give him a look and a listen, and give him a try. See everybody next time.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Way is in Training. Please come back again as we explore how training makes us better at our craft and better in our everyday lives. See all of you soon.